Ethan Mitchell's hands froze on the thick fur as the massive brown bear turned toward him, water still dripping from its enormous frame. The crowd of onlookers who had gathered to watch the rescue suddenly erupted in terrified screams. This wasn't supposed to happen. Wild bears don't approach their rescuers. Martha Clearwater stumbled backward, her walking cane clattering against the rocky shore as tourists scattered in every direction. Sarah Bennett's tranquilizer gun slipped from her trembling fingers, forgotten in the chaos of the moment. But Ethan couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the 600-pound grizzly gently placed one massive paw against his chest, exactly the way his father used to do when Ethan was 8 years old, the gesture Samuel Mitchell had called checking your heart. "Everyone stay back," Sarah shouted, though her voice cracked with disbelief. How could this bear know a gesture that died with his father 15 years ago? And why were those deep brown eyes looking at him like they recognized something more than just another human face? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 32-year-old Ethan Mitchell had never imagined his life would come to this, standing knee-deep in Swift Creek at dawn, pulling a drowning bear from the rushing waters, while his 8-year-old daughter Lucy waited for him back in their cramped trailer. The eviction notice, crumpled in his jacket pocket, served as a constant reminder that in 72 hours they'd have nowhere to call home. Whitefish, Montana, with its population of 8,000 souls, had been the Mitchell family's anchor for 3 generations. But for Ethan, it had become a graveyard of memories since his father Samuel's death 15 years ago in what everyone called a hunting accident. The official report was simple: experienced hunter, tragic fall, case closed. Yet something about that story had never sat right with Ethan, especially the way his father's hunting buddy Jake Thornfield couldn't meet his eyes at the funeral. Now working part-time maintenance for Glacier National Park barely kept food on the table. His late wife Emma's medical bills had consumed their savings, and the life insurance settlement had long since evaporated into rent and groceries. The job offer from Seattle, assistant manager at a corporate camping supply chain, represented escape from this place where every trail, every creek, every sunset reminded him of what he'd lost. Lucy had inherited her grandfather's love for wildlife, though she'd never met the man who died 3 months before her birth. She spent hours at their neighbor Martha Clearwater's kitchen table, listening to stories about Samuel Mitchell's legendary kindness toward animals. Martha, 75 and increasingly frail since her husband's passing 2 years ago, had become the closest thing to family they had left. "Your daddy was special," Martha would tell Lucy in her soft Crow Nation accent, her weathered hands always busy with beadwork. "Animals trusted him like they trust the earth itself. That's a gift that runs in blood." The irony wasn't lost on Ethan that he was terrified of the very creatures his father had loved. Since the accident, he'd avoided the deep woods, stuck to maintenance work on the park's outer trails, and planned their move to the city where the wildest animal Lucy would encounter was a pigeon. Dr. Sarah Bennett, the park's veterinarian, had been another constant in their small circle. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet competence of someone who'd seen too much, but refused to let it break her. Her own 8-year-old son had bonded with Lucy over their shared fascination with animals, and Sarah's gentle encouragement had been the only thing keeping Ethan from packing up months ago. "This place has more to offer than you think," she'd told him just last week, her green eyes serious as they watched their children chase fireflies. "Sometimes we have to stop running from our ghosts long enough to see what they're trying to show us." But ghosts don't pay rent, and Ethan had learned that survival meant making hard choices. In 3 days, he and Lucy would board a Greyhound bus heading west, leaving Montana and its memories behind forever. At least, that had been the plan before he'd heard the bear's desperate cries echoing across Swift Creek that October morning. The morning had started like any other, with Ethan making his routine rounds to clear debris from the park's main trails after the previous night's storm. Swift Creek ran higher than usual, its normally gentle current transformed into a churning torrent that had deposited fallen branches and rocks along the hiking path. He'd been working methodically, his mind occupied with the logistics of their impending move, how to pack their few belongings, whether Lucy's stuffed animals would fit in their single suitcase, how to explain to an 8-year-old that sometimes life forces you to start over. The sound reached him first, a low, desperate moaning that cut through the rushing water like a knife. Ethan paused, his rake suspended mid-swing, listening. The sound came again, weaker this time, and he felt his pulse quicken with recognition. Something was in serious trouble. Following the sound downstream, Ethan discovered the massive brown bear trapped against a fallen log, its head barely above the waterline. Debris from the storm had created a natural dam, and the bear had apparently been caught in the current while trying to cross. Its enormous body was wedged between rocks and branches, powerful muscles visibly straining against the relentless push of the water. For a moment, Ethan's old fears paralyzed him. This was exactly the kind of situation his father would have charged into without hesitation, but Ethan had spent 15 years avoiding such encounters. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to call the park rangers and wait for professionals with proper equipment. But as he watched, the bear's struggles grew weaker, its massive head dipping lower toward the water. Death was approaching with each passing minute, and help was at least 20 minutes away. The bear's eyes, when they briefly met his, held an intelligence and desperation that cut straight through his paralysis. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, already shrugging out of his jacket and kicking off his boots. The water hit him like an icy slap, stealing his breath and nearly knocking him off his feet. Swift Creek in October was barely above freezing, fed by mountain snowmelt that could kill a man in minutes. The current fought him with every step as he waded deeper, using fallen branches for support. The bear, sensing his approach, tried to lift its head higher, eyes locked on this unexpected potential rescuer. Up close, the animal was even more massive than Ethan had realized, easily 600 pounds of muscle and fur, with claws that could tear a man apart without effort. "Easy, big guy," Ethan found himself whispering, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "I'm going to try to help you, but you need to stay calm." The bear's breathing was labored, and Ethan could see cuts and scrapes along its flanks from the rocks. Working around to the upstream side, he began methodically removing the smaller debris that had accumulated around the animal's body. Each piece he pulled free allowed the water to flow more freely, gradually reducing the pressure holding the bear in place. "What in the Lord's name are you doing, Ethan Mitchell?" Martha Clearwater's voice cut through the sound of rushing water. The elderly woman stood on the bank, leaning heavily on her walking stick, her weathered face a mask of concern and determination. Behind her, Dr. Sarah Bennett was approaching at a run, a large medical bag bouncing against her hip. "The bear's trapped," Ethan called back, not pausing in his work. "It's going to drown if we don't get it free." Sarah had reached the water's edge and was already pulling equipment from her bag. "I've got a tranquilizer gun if we need it, but from the looks of things, this bear's too weak to be much of a threat right now." "Don't you dare shoot that animal," Martha commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Can't you see it's asking for help?" Working together, the three of them managed to clear enough debris to free the bear's powerful hindquarters. But the animal was exhausted, its movements growing increasingly sluggish as hypothermia set in. When Ethan finally managed to clear the last major branch, the bear simply floated there, too weak to swim to safety. Without thinking, Ethan wrapped his arms around the massive creature's torso and began pulling it toward shore. The bear's weight was enormous, and the current fought him every inch of the way. His muscles screamed with effort, and his vision began to blur from cold and exhaustion. Sarah waded in to help, grabbing the bear's front legs while Ethan supported its massive body. Together they managed to drag the unconscious animal onto the rocky shore where it lay motionless, its sides barely rising and falling with shallow breaths. "Is it alive?" Martha asked, her voice unusually soft. Sarah knelt beside the bear, checking for vital signs with practiced efficiency. "Weak pulse, but steady. Body temperature's dangerously low, but I think we got to it in time." As if responding to her words, the bear's eyes fluttered open, and that's when everything changed. The bear's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Within an hour, the massive animal had regained enough strength to stand, though it showed no inclination to leave. Instead, it remained close to Ethan, following him with an intelligence that made Sarah's veterinary training seem inadequate to explain what she was witnessing. "This isn't normal behavior," she murmured to Martha as they watched the bear gently sniff around Ethan's jacket, which was draped over a fallen log to dry. Wild bears don't form attachments this quickly, especially after trauma. But Martha's weathered face held a knowing expression that made Sarah uncomfortable. "Some connections run deeper than what your textbooks teach, child." The bear's behavior became even stranger when Lucy arrived after school, having heard about the rescue from classmates whose parents worked for the Park Service. Instead of displaying the territorial aggression Sarah expected, the enormous grizzly actually lowered itself to the ground, making itself less threatening as the 8-year-old approached. "Daddy, can I pet him?" Lucy asked, with the fearless curiosity that had always reminded Ethan so painfully of his father. "Absolutely not," Ethan started to say, but the words died in his throat as the bear did something that made his blood run cold. The animal looked directly at Lucy, then gently placed one massive paw over its heart. The same gesture Samuel Mitchell had taught his son decades ago, their secret signal that meant, "I love you," when words weren't enough. Sarah noticed Ethan's sudden pallor. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Before Ethan could answer, the bear rose and began walking purposefully toward the tree line, pausing to look back as if expecting to be followed. When Ethan didn't move, the animal repeated the gesture, this time adding a low, rumbling sound that was almost conversational. "He wants us to follow him," Lucy said with 8-year-old certainty. "Grandpa Sam used to make that same sound when he wanted to show me something special. Mom told me about it." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. Emma had been pregnant when Samuel died, and he'd shared stories about his father's mannerisms during those final months of her life. But Lucy had been too young to remember those conversations consciously. Against every instinct screaming at him to stay away from a wild animal, Ethan found himself following the bear into the woods. Sarah and Martha exchanged glances, but followed as well, Sarah keeping her tranquilizer gun ready, despite her growing sense that it wouldn't be needed. The bear led them along an old game trail that wound deeper into the forest than any official park path. After 20 minutes of walking, they emerged into a small clearing that took Ethan's breath away. Someone had made camp here years ago, a proper woodsman's camp with a fire ring, a lean-to shelter, and equipment carefully stored under waterproof tarps. But it was the carved initials on the large pine tree that made Ethan's knees buckle. SM plus Kodiak, surrounded by a rough heart, the letters weathered but still clearly visible. "Samuel Mitchell," Martha whispered, her voice full of recognition. "Your father made this place." With shaking hands, Ethan pulled back one of the tarps to reveal a collection of items that belonged unmistakably to his father. The old leather jacket Samuel had worn on every hunting trip, a field journal wrapped in oiled cloth, and a photograph tucked into a plastic bag. The picture showed a younger Samuel Mitchell sitting beside a bear cub, both of them illuminated by firelight. Sarah leaned over his shoulder to examine the photograph. "That's not possible. This bear is full grown, probably 8 or 9 years old. If this picture was taken when it was a cub..." 15 years ago, Ethan finished, his voice barely audible. Dad died 15 years ago. The journal's pages were filled with Samuel's familiar handwriting, documenting years of caring for an orphaned bear cub whose mother had been killed by poachers. Entry after entry described feeding schedules, medical treatments for injuries, and the gradual process of teaching the cub to survive in the wild while maintaining their bond. One entry, dated just days before Samuel's death, made Ethan's hands tremble as he read aloud. Kodiak is nearly grown now, strong enough to survive on his own. But I worry about what will happen to him if something happens to me. Jake's been asking too many questions about my hunting trips, and I don't trust his motives. If anything should happen, I pray someone will continue to protect this magnificent creature. He's not just a bear, he's family. Kodiak, Lucy breathed, and the bear's massive head turned toward her at the sound of his name. That's what Grandpa Sam called him. The implications crashed over Ethan like a wave. His father hadn't died in a hunting accident. He'd been protecting this bear. And for 15 years, Kodiak had been waiting in these woods, perhaps hoping for Samuel's return, perhaps simply living out the bond that had been forged between them. But as this revelation sank in, the sound of approaching footsteps made them all turn. Jake Thornfield emerged from the tree line, his face grim and his rifle raised not quite to shooting position, but ready to be lifted at a moment's notice. "Step away from that animal, Ethan," Jake commanded, his voice tight with an emotion Ethan couldn't identify. "You have no idea how dangerous that thing really is." The bear, Kodiak, immediately positioned himself between Jake and the others, a low growl rumbling from his throat. But there was something in Jake's eyes, something that spoke of old fear and older guilt, that made Ethan realize their discovery had just opened a wound that had been festering for 15 years. The tension in the clearing was thick enough to cut with a knife, as Jake Thornfield kept his rifle at the ready, his weathered face a mask of barely controlled emotion. Kodiak's protective stance hadn't wavered, the massive bear positioned like a living shield between Jake and the others. "Jake, put that gun down," Martha commanded with the authority of someone who'd known him since he was a boy pulling pranks on Main Street. "That animal hasn't shown one bit of aggression toward any of us." "You don't understand," Jake replied, his voice strained. "None of you understand what that bear represents, what it knows." Ethan clutched his father's journal tighter, pieces of a 15-year-old puzzle beginning to fall into place. "What does he know, Jake? What really happened to my father?" The older man's face went ashen, and for a moment his rifle wavered. Sarah took advantage of his distraction to slowly move Lucy behind the large pine tree, keeping her tranquilizer gun trained on Jake rather than the bear. "Your father was a stubborn fool," Jake said finally, his words heavy with old pain. "He should have minded his own business instead of playing protector to every creature in these woods." Over the following days, as news of the remarkable bear rescue spread through Whitefish, the small community found itself divided. Half the town was charmed by the story of Kodiak's loyalty and intelligence, while the other half worried about the safety implications of a wild bear that refused to return to its natural territory. Ethan had made the difficult decision to take emergency leave from his park maintenance job to stay with Kodiak, setting up a temporary camp near the clearing where his father's belongings had been hidden. Lucy, thrilled beyond measure to have a real-life connection to the grandfather she'd never known, convinced her father to let her skip school and join him. "It's educational," she argued with 8-year-old logic. "I'm learning about animal behavior and family history and camping skills all at once." Sarah had become a daily visitor, bringing medical supplies and conducting informal health checks on Kodiak while helping Ethan process the emotional weight of his discoveries. The bear seemed to understand that she was a healer, allowing her to examine old scars and treat minor cuts with remarkable patience. "His muscle development suggests he's been living completely wild for years," she explained to Ethan as she cleaned a scratch on Kodiak's shoulder. But his social behaviors are unlike anything I've seen in wild bears. Your father did something extraordinary here." Martha, despite her age and the difficulty of the hike, insisted on visiting the camp daily. She would sit for hours sharing stories of Samuel Mitchell with Lucy, while Kodiak lay nearby, his massive head resting on his paws as if he understood every word. "Your grandfather had a gift," Martha told Lucy one afternoon as they watched Ethan teach Kodiak to fish in the old way Samuel had shown him as a child. "He could see the soul in every living thing. That's why the animals trusted him so completely." But their peaceful routine was constantly threatened by Jake's increasing pressure to have Kodiak relocated. He'd filed complaints with the Park Service, contacted state wildlife officials, and even reached out to local media to paint the situation as a public safety crisis. "That bear is exhibiting abnormal behavior," he told anyone who would listen. "Wild animals that lose their fear of humans become dangerous. It's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt." The controversy reached a boiling point when Jake convinced a local news crew to investigate the story. The reporter, a young woman from Billings named Rebecca Hayes, arrived expecting a simple human interest piece about wildlife rescue, but quickly sensed there was a deeper story lurking beneath the surface. "Mr. Thornfield, you seem unusually invested in this particular bear's removal," she observed during their recorded interview. "Is there a personal connection here?" Jake's visible discomfort on camera was noticed by several town residents, including Martha, who had lived in Whitefish long enough to remember when Jake's hunting license had been temporarily suspended for undisclosed violations around the time of Samuel's death. Meanwhile, Ethan was making discoveries of his own as he worked through his father's journal. The final entries painted a picture of a man increasingly concerned about illegal hunting activity in the park, with specific mentions of poachers targeting bears for their gallbladders and claws, valuable commodities in certain black markets. "Kodiak isn't safe as long as these people are operating," Samuel had written. "I've reported what I've seen to the authorities, but I suspect some of them may be involved. Jake's been asking too many questions about my research sites, and I've seen him in areas where he has no business hunting." The journal also revealed that Samuel had been working unofficially with federal wildlife agents, documenting illegal activities and gathering evidence. His final entry, written the day before his death, contained a chilling prediction. "If something happens to me, it won't be an accident. I've gotten too close to something big, and there are people who will do anything to protect their operation." As Ethan shared these revelations with Sarah and Martha, Kodiak's behavior became even more protective. The bear seemed to sense the growing tension in the group, positioning himself to maintain visual contact with all the humans under his care while keeping watch for potential threats. "It's like he knows we're his family now," Lucy observed with the simple clarity that children often possess. "Just like Grandpa Sam taught him." The situation escalated further when state wildlife officials, responding to Jake's complaints and media pressure, arrived to assess whether Kodiak posed a legitimate threat to public safety. The team, led by a stern woman named Director Patricia Walsh, came equipped with tranquilizer equipment and a transport trailer. "This animal needs to be relocated immediately," Director Walsh announced after observing Kodiak from a distance. "His behavior patterns indicate dangerous habituation to human contact." "With respect, ma'am," Sarah interjected, her veterinary credentials lending weight to her words, "this bear has shown no aggressive behaviors whatsoever. His interactions with humans have been entirely peaceful and protective." "That's exactly the problem," Walsh replied. "A bear that seeks out human contact is a bear that will eventually hurt someone, intentionally or not. We've seen this pattern too many times before." The confrontation that followed revealed the depth of the community's division. Supporters of Kodiak, led by Martha, and including many of the town's older residents who remembered Samuel Mitchell fondly, argued passionately for the bear's right to remain in his chosen territory. "This is his home," Martha declared, her voice carrying the weight of her 75 years. Samuel Mitchell gave his life protecting this creature, and we have no right to undo that sacrifice. But Jake's faction, composed mainly of hunters and parents worried about children's safety, pushed just as hard for removal. "One child gets mauled," Jake argued, "and we'll all have blood on our hands." The debate became so heated that Mayor Tom Bradford was forced to call an emergency town meeting where residents could voice their opinions before the state made its final decision. The meeting, held in the high school gymnasium, drew nearly half the town's population. Ethan found himself thrust into the uncomfortable position of spokesperson for Kodiak's supporters, despite his own lingering uncertainties about the situation. Standing before his neighbors and friends, holding his father's journal, he struggled to find words that could bridge the gap between those who saw Kodiak as a magical connection to the past and those who saw him as a ticking time bomb. "My father died protecting this bear," he said finally, his voice barely steady. "I don't fully understand why yet, but I know it wasn't random. There's something here worth protecting, something worth fighting for. And until I understand what that is, I can't let you take him away." The meeting ended without resolution, but it had served one important purpose. It forced Jake Thornfield to defend his position publicly, and his discomfort under questioning was noticed by several astute observers, including Rebecca Hayes, who had decided to extend her stay in Whitefish to investigate the deeper story she sensed brewing beneath the surface. As the crowd dispersed, Ethan overheard Jake speaking quietly with Director Walsh near the gymnasium's exit. Though he couldn't make out all the words, the urgency in Jake's voice and the way he kept glancing toward Ethan suggested that the older man's motivations went far beyond simple concern for public safety. That night, as Ethan sat by the campfire with Lucy, sleeping peacefully in their tent, and Kodiak maintaining his protective watch from the edge of the clearing, he made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow he would confront Jake Thornfield directly and demand the truth about his father's death, regardless of the consequences. The confrontation came sooner than Ethan had planned. Just after dawn, as he was preparing coffee over the campfire while Lucy still slept and Kodiak foraged nearby, Jake Thornfield emerged from the tree line with Director Walsh and 2 armed state wildlife officers. Their presence was clearly meant to intimidate, and it worked. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he set down his coffee cup. "This ends today, Ethan," Jake announced, his voice carrying a finality that made Kodiak's head snap up from where he'd been investigating a fallen log. "Director Walsh has the authority to remove that animal immediately, and I'm here to make sure it happens without incident." But before Walsh could respond, Martha Clearwater appeared from the opposite direction, moving with surprising speed for her age and leaning heavily on her walking stick. Behind her came Sarah Bennett, carrying her veterinary bag and wearing an expression of grim determination. "Over my dead body," Martha declared, positioning herself between the officers and Kodiak. "This bear has done nothing wrong, and you have no legal right to remove him from his natural habitat." "Actually, ma'am, we do," Director Walsh replied, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. When a wild animal exhibits abnormal attachment behaviors toward humans, it becomes a public safety issue that falls under state jurisdiction. Sarah stepped forward, her veterinary credentials giving her voice authority. "Director Walsh, I've been monitoring this bear's behavior for days. He shows no signs of aggression, no food-seeking behaviors around humans, and no territorial marking that would indicate he's claiming this area as his exclusive domain. By every scientific measure, he's simply choosing to remain in familiar territory." "Which is exactly the problem," Jake interjected, his agitation becoming more apparent with each passing moment. "Wild animals aren't supposed to choose anything based on human contact. That bear is a time bomb waiting to explode." Ethan watched Jake's face carefully, noting the way the older man's eyes kept darting toward the tree where Samuel's initials were carved, the way his hands clenched and unclenched around his rifle. You're awfully invested in this, Jake. Almost like you're afraid of something. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment Jake's carefully maintained composure cracked. I'm not afraid of anything except seeing someone get killed by that monster. Monster? Lucy's voice was small but fierce as she emerged from the tent, her hair still messy from sleep but her young face set with determination. Kodiak isn't a monster. He's family. The sight of the 8-year-old girl standing fearlessly near the massive bear seemed to unnerve the wildlife officers. But it was Jake's reaction that caught everyone's attention. His face went white, and he took an involuntary step backward. "Get her away from that thing," he whispered, his voice cracking with something that sounded like panic. "Please, just get her away from it." But instead of moving away, Lucy did something that would haunt Jake for the rest of his life. She walked directly to Kodiak and placed her small hand on his massive shoulder, looking Jake straight in the eye as she did so. "He won't hurt me," she said with absolute certainty. "He promised Grandpa Sam he'd protect our family." That's when Jake Thornfield finally broke. "Your grandfather is dead because of that animal," he shouted, his rifle trembling in his hands. "Samuel Mitchell died because he chose that bear over human common sense, and I'll be damned if I let the same thing happen to you." The clearing fell silent except for the sound of Jake's labored breathing and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Ethan felt his world tilt as the implications of Jake's words sank in. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "What exactly do you mean he died because of Kodiak?" Jake's resolve crumbled like a dam giving way. 15 years of guilt and fear poured out in a torrent of words that explained everything and changed nothing. "There were poachers," he began, his voice barely audible. "Professional hunters from out of state, paying big money for bear parts. Gallbladders, claws, whatever they could sell to overseas buyers. I was their local contact. I helped them find the bears, showed them the best hunting spots, took a cut of the profits." Sarah's intake of breath was audible, but no one else moved as Jake continued his confession. Samuel figured it out. He'd been tracking illegal kills for months, documenting everything, building a case. "He knew it was me, but he gave me a chance to come clean, to help him stop the others." Jake's eyes found Ethan's, and the pain there was genuine. "But I was in too deep. I owed money to dangerous people, and the poaching was the only way I could pay them back." "So you killed him," Ethan said, the words coming out flat and emotionless. "No!" Jake's denial was immediate and desperate. "I never meant for him to die. I told the poachers that Samuel was getting close, that they needed to be more careful. I thought they'd back off, maybe leave the area for a while." "But they didn't," Martha said, her voice heavy with understanding. "They decided to eliminate the problem," Jake continued, tears now streaming down his weathered face. "They set up an ambush, made it look like a hunting accident. Samuel was supposed to be alone, but he had that damn bear with him. Kodiak tried to protect him, fought like hell, but—" Jake's voice broke completely. "Samuel died trying to shield Kodiak from the gunfire. His last words were about protecting that animal, making sure it survived. The poachers wanted to kill the bear too, eliminate the witness, but I couldn't let that happen. I told them the bear had run off, was probably miles away by then." The revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow. His father hadn't died in a random hunting accident. He'd been murdered for trying to protect the wildlife he loved. And Jake, the man Ethan had trusted, the man who'd spoken at Samuel's funeral about what a good friend he'd been, had been complicit in that murder. "Where are they now?" Director Walsh asked, her official demeanor returning as she processed the implications of Jake's confession. "These poachers?" "Prison, mostly," Jake replied. "The feds caught up with them a few years later on different charges, but the damage was done." Samuel was dead, and I'd been living with the guilt ever since. So you wanted Kodiak removed because he's a witness, Sarah said, understanding dawning in her voice. Because as long as he's alive, he's a reminder of what really happened. Jake nodded miserably. Every time I see that bear, I see Samuel dying all over again. I see my cowardice, my greed, my failure to do the right thing when it mattered. But it was Lucy who delivered the final blow, her young voice cutting through Jake's self-pity with devastating clarity. Grandpa Sam died protecting Kodiak because he knew love is stronger than fear, she said, her hand still resting on the bear's shoulder. And now, Kodiak protects us because Grandpa Sam taught him that's what family does. The truth of her words seemed to hit everyone at once. Kodiak hadn't been waiting in the woods for 15 years out of confusion or habit. He'd been honoring a promise made to a dying man, a commitment to protect the family Samuel Mitchell had left behind. Director Walsh lowered her tranquilizer gun, her professional judgment warring with the emotional weight of what she'd just heard. The wildlife officers looked to her for guidance, clearly uncertain how to proceed in a situation that had moved far beyond their normal protocols. But it was Jake himself who provided the resolution, his voice barely above a whisper as he made the decision that would define the rest of his life. "I'll withdraw my complaints," he said, meeting Ethan's eyes with tremendous effort. "I'll tell the state that I was wrong about the bear, that he's not a threat, and I'll turn myself in to the federal authorities for my part in the poaching ring." The clearing fell silent again as everyone processed this unexpected turn of events. Kodiak, as if sensing that the immediate threat had passed, moved closer to Lucy and gently nuzzled her shoulder in a gesture of protection and affection that no one could mistake for anything other than love. Jake's confession should have brought closure, but instead it unleashed a chain of events that threatened to destroy everything Ethan thought he'd gained. Within hours of Jake's admission, federal agents arrived in Whitefish to investigate the 15-year-old murder case, and their presence brought unwelcome attention from national media outlets, hungry for a story about corruption, wildlife crime, and a bear who remembered. The peaceful clearing that had become Ethan and Lucy's sanctuary was suddenly overrun with FBI investigators, forensic teams, and reporters. Kodiak, overwhelmed by the chaos and unfamiliar voices, retreated deeper into the woods, breaking the fragile bond that had been rebuilding between him and the Mitchell family. "We need to conduct a full investigation of the original crime scene," Special Agent Rebecca Torres explained to Ethan as crime scene tape went up around areas where his father's belongings had been hidden. "This campsite is now evidence in a federal murder case." The media attention was even worse. News vans lined the narrow road leading to the park, and reporters with cameras tried to follow Ethan and Lucy wherever they went. The story had everything needed for viral content: murder, corruption, a grieving family, and a loyal bear who'd waited 15 years for justice. "Local man discovers father was murdered, while son befriends killer's witness bear," read one particularly sensational headline that made Ethan's stomach turn. But the worst blow came when Director Walsh, under pressure from state officials concerned about liability issues, announced that Kodiak would need to be temporarily relocated while the investigation proceeded. "We can't have a potentially traumatized wild animal in an active crime scene," she explained to the assembled media, her words carefully chosen for maximum bureaucratic cover. "The bear will be moved to a secure wildlife facility until federal investigators complete their work." Lucy's reaction was immediate and devastating. The 8-year-old who had been so brave throughout everything finally broke down, sobbing in a way that made grown men turn away in discomfort. "You can't take him away," she pleaded with anyone who would listen. "He's the only piece of Grandpa Sam we have left. Please don't take him away from us." Ethan felt helpless in a way he hadn't experienced since Emma's death. Once again, Forces beyond his control were stripping away everything that mattered, leaving him powerless to protect the people he loved. The job offer in Seattle suddenly seemed less like an escape and more like the only rational option left. "Maybe we should just go," he told Sarah that evening as they sat on Martha's porch, watching Lucy sleep fitfully on the old woman's couch. "Take the job in Seattle. Start over somewhere that doesn't have all these ghosts." Sarah's response was sharper than he'd expected. "So you're going to run away again, just like you've been doing for 15 years? "I'm not running away," Ethan protested. "I'm trying to protect my daughter from more heartbreak. By teaching her that love isn't worth fighting for?" Martha's voice carried the weight of 7 decades of hard-won wisdom. "By showing her that when things get difficult, the answer is always to give up?" But even Martha's gentle criticism couldn't prepare Ethan for what happened next. The wildlife relocation team arrived at dawn with tranquilizer equipment and a specialized transport vehicle, prepared to capture Kodiak, regardless of the emotional cost to the Mitchell family. The operation went wrong from the very beginning. Kodiak, already stressed by the chaos of the investigation, panicked when the team tried to corner him near the creek. The massive bear, who had shown nothing but gentleness toward humans for days, suddenly reverted to wild behavior driven by fear and confusion. The first tranquilizer dart missed its mark, striking a tree trunk inches from Kodiak's head. The bear's response was immediate and terrifying, a roar of rage and pain that echoed through the forest like a primal scream. He charged toward the creek where Lucy had been sitting with her feet in the water, unaware of the danger approaching. What happened next would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Lucy, hearing Kodiak's distressed roar, stood up and moved toward him instead of away, her 8-year-old mind unable to process that the gentle giant who had protected her might now be a threat. "Lucy, no!" Ethan's scream cut through the morning air as he ran toward the creek, but he was too far away to reach her in time. The second tranquilizer dart hit its target, striking Kodiak in the shoulder just as he reached the water's edge where Lucy stood. But instead of dropping immediately, the massive bear stumbled forward, his enormous weight carrying him toward the child who had shown him nothing but love and trust. Time seemed to slow as Kodiak fought against the tranquilizer's effects, his massive body swaying dangerously close to Lucy's small frame. For a terrifying moment, it looked as though 800 pounds of panicked bear might crush the child beneath him. But even in his drugged confusion, some part of Kodiak remembered who Lucy was, what she meant to him. With his last conscious effort, the great bear twisted his falling body away from her, sacrificing his own safety to protect the granddaughter of the man who had died for him. Kodiak hit the creek with a splash that sent water cascading over Lucy, but his body landed harmlessly in the deeper water several feet away from where she stood. The sight of the unconscious bear floating face down in the current triggered another round of panic as the relocation team rushed to prevent him from drowning while sedated. Lucy's piercing scream as she watched her protector being dragged from the water brought Ethan to his knees. In trying to save Kodiak from relocation, they had created the exact scenario everyone had feared, a dangerous situation involving a child and a wild animal. The image of Lucy standing in the creek, soaking wet and sobbing, while wildlife officers worked to revive an unconscious Kodiak, would be captured by news cameras and broadcast around the world within hours. It was the kind of footage that ended careers, destroyed reputations, and provided definitive proof that keeping a wild bear near a child had been recklessly irresponsible from the beginning. As paramedics checked Lucy for injuries and veterinarians worked to stabilize Kodiak, Ethan realized that his worst fears had been realized. Everything he'd tried to protect had been lost in a single moment of chaos and miscommunication, and this time, there might be no way to put the pieces back together. The aftermath of the creek incident was devastating in ways Ethan hadn't anticipated. Within hours, video footage of Lucy's near miss with Kodiak had gone viral on social media, sparking a national debate about wildlife management, parental responsibility, and the dangers of anthropomorphizing wild animals. The comments sections were brutal, with thousands of strangers passing judgment on Ethan's fitness as a father and calling for his arrest for child endangerment. But the real blow came from an unexpected source. Child Protective Services arrived at Martha's house the next morning with a court order to conduct an emergency welfare evaluation of Lucy. The caseworker, a stern woman named Patricia Hoffman, had reviewed the viral footage and deemed the situation a clear case of a parent putting their child in imminent danger. "Mr. Mitchell," she said as she set up her recording equipment in Martha's living room, "I need you to explain to me how you thought it was appropriate to expose your 8-year-old daughter to a 600-pound wild predator." Lucy, who had been unusually quiet since the incident, suddenly found her voice. "Kodiak would never hurt me," she said with fierce certainty. "He was protecting me, just like Grandpa Sam taught him." "Sweetheart," Miss Hoffman replied with practiced patience, "wild animals don't understand the difference between protecting and hurting. What you saw as protection was actually a very dangerous animal acting on instinct." The interview that followed was a nightmare of bureaucratic skepticism and 8-year-old logic colliding in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. Lucy insisted that Kodiak was family, that he had deliberately fallen away from her to keep her safe, that separating them was cruel and wrong. Miss Hoffman took notes that would determine whether Lucy could remain in her father's custody. Meanwhile, Kodiak's condition had become a source of additional controversy. The tranquilizer dosage, calculated for a bear of average size, had been insufficient for an animal of Kodiak's massive proportions. He had regained consciousness while still in the transport vehicle, leading to a terrifying scene of an enraged grizzly trying to break free from a steel cage while traveling down a Montana highway. The transport had been forced to pull over while veterinarians administered additional sedatives, but not before Kodiak had injured himself trying to escape. Deep cuts on his paws from clawing at the cage bars and a dislocated shoulder from throwing his weight against the walls had left him in need of emergency medical care. Dr. Sarah Bennett had volunteered to oversee his treatment at the State Wildlife Facility, but her reports were grim. "He's not eating," she told Ethan over the phone, her voice heavy with professional concern. "Bears in captivity can develop severe depression, and Kodiak is showing all the warning signs. He just lies in the corner of his enclosure, staring at the wall." The news hit Lucy harder than anyone expected. The resilient little girl who had faced her father's struggles and her grandfather's absence with remarkable strength finally cracked under the weight of knowing that Kodiak was suffering because of what happened to her. "It's my fault," she sobbed to Martha, while Ethan was meeting with lawyers about the CPS investigation. "If I hadn't been at the creek, none of this would have happened. Kodiak is sad because of me." Martha's weathered hands stroked Lucy's hair as the old woman struggled to find words of comfort. "Child, some burdens are too heavy for young shoulders to carry. This isn't your fault. It's the fault of a world that's forgotten how to see love in unexpected places." But while Lucy blamed herself and Kodiak wasted away in captivity, Ethan was making a discovery that would change everything. Special Agent Torres had asked him to review his father's journal more carefully, looking for any details that might help with the federal investigation into the poaching ring. What Ethan found in the margins of the final entries made his blood run cold. His father hadn't just been documenting the poachers' activities, he'd been gathering evidence of something much larger. Names, dates, and financial transactions that suggested the illegal hunting operation had been funded by a corporation with interests in land development around Glacier National Park. Samuel Mitchell wasn't just trying to save bears, Agent Torres explained as she reviewed the new evidence. He stumbled onto a scheme to eliminate predator populations so that certain areas could be developed for commercial use. Your father died because he threatened a multi-million-dollar land deal. The revelation that Samuel's murder had been part of a larger conspiracy brought federal resources flooding into the investigation, but it also brought new dangers. The people behind the original scheme had too much invested to let 15-year-old evidence surface without a fight. The first sign of escalation came when someone broke into Martha's house while she was visiting Kodiak at the wildlife facility with Sarah. Nothing was stolen, but the message was clear. Samuel's journal and any other evidence needed to disappear before it could cause more problems. "You need to consider witness protection," Agent Torres advised Ethan after the break-in. "These people have already killed once to protect their interests. They won't hesitate to do it again." But the suggestion of leaving Montana, even temporarily, sent Lucy into a panic that made her previous distress seem mild by comparison. "We can't leave Kodiak," she pleaded, her small hands clutching Ethan's shirt. "He's waiting for us to bring him home. If we leave, he'll think we abandoned him just like everyone else." The truth of her words was confirmed by Sarah's increasingly worried reports from the wildlife facility. Kodiak's condition was deteriorating rapidly. His refusal to eat now accompanied by self-destructive behaviors that had the veterinary staff deeply concerned. "He's given up," Sarah told Ethan during one of their late-night phone calls. "I've seen this in other animals who've lost their will to live. If something doesn't change soon, we're going to lose him." The crisis came to a head when Ms. Hoffman delivered her preliminary recommendation to family court. Based on the viral footage and testimony from witnesses, she concluded that Lucy was in imminent danger while in her father's care and recommended immediate temporary custody be granted to the state pending a full investigation. "Mr. Mitchell has demonstrated a pattern of poor judgment that puts his daughter at risk," her report stated. "His emotional attachment to this dangerous animal has compromised his ability to prioritize his child's safety." The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, giving Ethan 3 days to find a way to keep his family together while protecting the evidence that could bring his father's killers to justice. But as he sat in Martha's kitchen, reading the custody paperwork by lamplight while Lucy slept fitfully on the couch, a different plan began to form in his mind. What if the problem wasn't Kodiak's presence in their lives, but his absence from it? What if the bear's deteriorating condition and Lucy's emotional breakdown were both symptoms of the same fundamental truth, that they belonged together, that separating them was causing more harm than any theoretical danger ever could? The idea was crazy, potentially illegal, and almost certainly career-ending for everyone involved. But as Ethan listened to his daughter cry in her sleep, calling out for a grandfather she'd never met and a bear who was dying of loneliness 50 miles away, he realized that sometimes the most rational choice was the one that looked completely irrational to everyone else. He picked up his phone and dialed Sarah's number, knowing that what he was about to propose would either save them all or destroy any chance they had of staying together. "Sarah," he said when she answered, "I need you to listen carefully. I think I know how to fix this, but I'm going to need your help to do something that could get us all arrested." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Ethan wondered if the call had dropped. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was steady, despite the late hour and the weight of what he was asking. "Tell me what you need." As Ethan outlined his plan, he realized he was betting everything: his custody of Lucy, his freedom, and quite possibly their lives, on the hope that love really was stronger than fear, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was the safest choice available. The clock on Martha's mantel chimed midnight, marking the beginning of what would either be the day they lost everything or the day they finally came home. The plan Ethan had conceived was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its potential consequences. Rather than fighting the system that wanted to separate his family, He would prove that Kodiak belonged with them by demonstrating the bear's deteriorating condition was directly linked to their separation. But executing this plan required Sarah to risk her veterinary license, Martha to violate federal orders, and Ethan to essentially kidnap a federally protected animal. "You're talking about breaking Kodiak out of a state wildlife facility," Sarah said, as they huddled in Martha's kitchen at 2 in the morning, their voices barely above whispers. "That's grand theft at minimum, possibly domestic terrorism charges if they want to push it. And you're talking about letting that bear die in a cage while my daughter gets taken away by social services," Ethan replied, his exhaustion making his voice raw. "Tell me which one of those outcomes we can actually live with." Martha, who had been listening from her rocking chair by the window, finally spoke. "In my culture, we believe that some bonds are stronger than human laws. When the spirits bring beings together for a purpose, separating them creates an imbalance that harms everyone involved." Sarah looked between them, her scientific training warring with what she'd witnessed over the past week. "Even if we could get him out, and that's a massive if, where would we take him? The whole state is looking for this bear now. Every park ranger, every wildlife officer, every police department has his description. We take him home." Lucy's small voice cut through their debate. None of them had noticed her wake up, but she was standing in the doorway in her pajamas, her young face set with determination that reminded Ethan painfully of his father. "We take him to Grandpa Sam's special place, where they were happy together." The adults stared at her, each processing the implications of what she'd suggested. The remote clearing where Samuel's belongings had been hidden was still officially part of the crime scene, but the federal investigators had finished their work there. More importantly, it was federal land, which meant different jurisdictions, different agencies, and potentially more sympathetic officials who might be willing to listen before acting. "It could work," Sarah said slowly, her mind already working through the logistics. "If we could get him there and keep him stable long enough to document his recovery, we might have evidence that separation is actually harming him more than staying with you." But Ethan was already shaking his head. "It's too dangerous. If we get caught, Lucy loses both her father and any chance of staying with Martha." "I can't risk that. And if you don't try," Martha said gently, "Lucy loses her faith that love is worth fighting for. Sometimes, Ethan, the safest choice is the one that looks most dangerous to fearful eyes." The debate continued until dawn, with each of them raising objections and finding solutions, identifying risks and calculating alternatives. By the time the sun rose over the Montana mountains, they had either conceived a plan that could save them all or convinced themselves to commit collective career suicide. Sarah would use her veterinary credentials to access the wildlife facility during the evening shift change, when staffing was minimal and security protocols were more relaxed. She would sedate Kodiak with a mild tranquilizer that would make him manageable but not unconscious, then load him into her veterinary van under the pretense of transporting him for emergency medical treatment. Martha would drive her old pickup truck to the clearing and set up a proper camp with food, water, and medical supplies. Her age and frail appearance would make her less suspicious to any park rangers who might encounter her, and her Crow Nation heritage gave her legitimate cultural reasons to be in that part of the forest. Ethan would take Lucy and disappear for 12 hours, creating an alibi that would protect them if the plan went wrong. They would spend the day in Kalispell, visiting the library and the museum, creating a paper trail that showed they were nowhere near the wildlife facility when Kodiak disappeared. The plan required precise timing, enormous luck, and the cooperation of everyone from the night shift guards to the federal agents monitoring the crime scene. What it didn't require was for them to think too carefully about the felony charges they would face if everything went wrong. "Last chance to back out," Ethan told them as they prepared to separate that morning. "Once we start this, there's no going back." "Daddy," Lucy said, taking his hand with 8-year-old gravity. "Grandpa Sam didn't back down when Kodiak needed him. We can't either." The day passed with agonizing slowness. Ethan and Lucy went through the motions of their alibi activities, checking out books and visiting exhibits while Ethan's phone buzzed with updates from Sarah and Martha. Each text message was carefully coded, but the tension was evident in every word. Package delivery delayed, extra paperwork meant the shift change at the facility was running late. Campsite setup proceeding smoothly meant Martha had reached the clearing without incident. Veterinary consultation scheduled for 8 p.m. meant Sarah was about to attempt the most dangerous part of their plan. At exactly 8:15, Ethan's phone rang with a call that would either confirm their success or seal their fate. Sarah's voice was shaky but triumphant. "The patient is responding well to treatment and is being transported to the specialized care facility," she said, her words carefully chosen in case anyone was monitoring their communications. "Estimated arrival time is 90 minutes. The drive to the clearing was the longest of Ethan's life. Lucy sat beside him in unusual silence, clutching the stuffed bear that had been her constant companion since infancy. When they finally reached the familiar trail that led to Samuel's hidden campsite, Ethan's hands were shaking so badly he could barely turn off the engine. They hiked through the gathering darkness, guided by Martha's lantern, and when they finally emerged into the clearing, the sight that greeted them was both miraculous and heartbreaking. Kodiak was lying peacefully beside the fire, his massive head resting on his paws while Sarah monitored his vital signs. But his physical deterioration was shocking. He had lost at least 50 pounds, his coat was dull, and his eyes held a listlessness that spoke of profound depression. Lucy's reaction was immediate and devastating. She ran to the bear without hesitation, dropping to her knees beside his head and wrapping her small arms around his neck. "I'm so sorry, Kodiak," she whispered through her tears. "I'm so sorry they took you away from us." What happened next would be burned into Ethan's memory forever. Kodiak, who had barely moved for days, according to Sarah's reports, slowly lifted his massive head and gently nuzzled Lucy's cheek. The gesture was so tender, so clearly deliberate, that even Sarah's scientific skepticism crumbled. "My God," she breathed. "Look at his vitals." The portable monitors she'd brought showed Kodiak's heart rate and breathing stabilizing for the first time in weeks. The reunion with Lucy was having an immediate, measurable effect on his physical condition. Over the following hours, as they maintained their vigil around the campfire, Kodiak's recovery was remarkable. He accepted food from Lucy's hands, allowed Ethan to clean his wounds, and gradually regained the alertness and intelligence that had made him so extraordinary in the first place. But their peace was shattered at dawn when the sound of approaching helicopters echoed through the forest. Federal agents, state wildlife officers, and local police had finally tracked them down, and the clearing was about to be surrounded by enough firepower to end their lives if anyone made the wrong move. "This is Special Agent Torres," a voice called through a bullhorn. "We know you're in there, and we know you have the bear. We need everyone to come out slowly with their hands visible." Ethan looked at Lucy, who was still sitting beside Kodiak with absolute trust and love radiating from her small face. In that moment, he realized that regardless of what happened next, they had already won something more valuable than freedom or safety. They had proven that love really could transcend the boundaries that society tried to impose on it. "It's going to be okay," he told his daughter, though he had no idea if that was true. "Whatever happens, we did the right thing." As they prepared to face the consequences of their choices, Kodiak rose to his feet and positioned himself protectively between the Mitchell family and the approaching authorities. But instead of the aggressive posture everyone expected, the great bear simply stood there, calm and dignified, as if he understood that this moment would determine not just his fate, but the fate of everyone he had come to love. Agent Torres emerged from the tree line first, her weapon drawn but pointed toward the ground. When she saw the scene in the clearing, the peaceful bear, the unharmed child, the makeshift family gathered around a dying campfire, her professional composure wavered for just a moment. "Mr. Mitchell," she called, her voice carrying across the clearing, "we need to talk." What followed would either be a conversation that changed everything or the beginning of the end for the most unusual family Montana had ever seen. But as Ethan took Lucy's hand and stepped forward to meet their fate, he knew that whatever the cost, some bonds were worth any price to protect. The sun rose fully over the clearing, casting long shadows that seemed to connect the past with the present, the living with the dead, and the wild with the civilized in ways that defied every rule except the one that mattered most: that love, in all its forms, was the only force powerful enough to heal a broken world. Sometimes, the most profound connections in our lives come from the most unexpected sources. When Ethan Mitchell pulled that drowning bear from Swift Creek, he had no idea he was rescuing a living link to his father's legacy of love and protection. What started as a simple act of compassion became a journey that transformed not just his family, but an entire community's understanding of what it means to truly belong to each other. Through Lucy's fearless trust, Martha's ancient wisdom, and Kodiak's unwavering loyalty, we see that family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes it's forged by the choices we make when love calls us to act beyond our fears. Sarah's willingness to risk everything for what was right, Jake's courage to finally confess his guilt, and the federal agent's decision to see truth over protocol all remind us that it's never too late to choose compassion over convenience. In a world that often feels divided and disconnected, Ethan and Kodiak's story proves that healing happens when we open our hearts to unexpected forms of love, when we honor the promises made by those who came before us, and when we trust that some bonds transcend even the boundaries between species. What unexpected friendship or connection has changed your life in ways you never imagined? Have you ever had to fight for someone or something you loved, even when others didn't understand? Share your stories in the comments below. Your experiences of love, loyalty, and second chances matter more than you know.